1883 and died in 1924. You do a little math on those dates, and he wasn't hardly even a middle-aged man when he passed away. He was born in circumstances that made him feel triply alienated, and it really affected his writing. He was born in a middle-class home. The father was able to send him to good schools, and he eventually became a lawyer for an insurance company. And he was a good worker, but he always loved to write stories instead of doing his work. Nevertheless, he did good work. He worked for an insurance company that dealt with a lot of mines and miners. It is to Kafka that we owe the safety helmet. Are you with me? So today, as construction workers wear their safety helmet hats, that was Franz Kafka's idea and invention. He felt alienated, one, because he didn't get along with his dad. His dad was all pro-business, make money, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And he was an artist type who would rather be writing his stories quietly in his room. So he didn't really get along within his own family. Second, he was German speaking in Czechoslovakia. So he did not speak Czech. And so he felt he did not really fit into Czech society, that he was, due to his language difference, a kind of outsider there. And finally, he was Jewish. And you will remember from your history that those years before World War II were not good years for people who were Jewish in Europe. Give me a nod. There was racial prejudice long before World War II. World War II just brought it to a head and highlighted how badly things were. But he faced prejudice because he was Jewish. He also contracted tuberculosis, a disease that killed so many, especially writers of those years. And it was in those years kind of a slow-burning death sentence. People knew they would die young, they just didn't know exactly how young. So he met and he fell in love several times, and he even got engaged, but he never got married, probably in part because he knew he wasn't going to live very long, and it might be a great hardship on whoever he married to have to take care of him in his declining health, and then be a widow at a relatively young age. So even though he was engaged, had a series of girlfriends, he never married. He never published anything in his lifetime. Nevertheless, he has become one of the most famous writers of Europe during this time. He had a friend named Max Brod. And on his deathbed, he asked his friend, "When I die, which won't be long, please burn all my manuscripts. I don't want anything I've written to be published." He died, and Max Brod set about publishing everything he could that Kafka had written. Are you following me?
Did he get like?
It's an interesting philosophical and ethical question. To what degree do we have to stick true to a deathbed promise that we make someone? Are you following me? If we did not have Max Brod breaking his promise, we would not have 4 great works of European literature, do you not? Okay. I think we would also not have other kinds of artistic works that people felt just weren't good enough, but only because they were filled with self-doubt, maybe even self-hatred. So since Max Brod did not keep his promise, we have seen what an interesting and unusual and great writer Kafka really was. So I don't really have an answer on to whether ethically that's the right thing to do or not, but that's what happened. Okay? 4 works specifically I want you to remember the name of. First is our story for today, the Metamorphosis. Another is called The Hunger Artist. This is a particularly sad story. They're actually all quite sad stories, in which a person intentionally starves himself to death. And Kafka himself, in part, died from tuberculosis and in part from self-starvation. Okay? I think since he felt he was going to die a slow, lingering, tubercular death, he hastened that by not eating at the end of his life. The trial. In the trial, a person is under arrest and goes before a tribunal, but never knows what crime he's being tried for. Always this sense that he's done something wrong, but not knowing exactly what it is. And finally, in the penal colony. You can really see, even just from the titles of these works, that we're dealing with someone who's looking at the darker side of life. Someone that feels they are entrapped by something, either literally imprisoned in the story, or metaphorically imprisoned in our story of the Metamorphosis, we'll come to that in a few minutes, from which there is no escape, that people are just trapped in some kind of horrible circumstance that they would like to get out of and yet cannot. In technique, there's an unusual technique that Kafka uses that literally cannot be translated into English. We don't really have this kind of construction in our language. I'm going to do my best to illustrate the way this works, but it's a poor illustration. Are you with me? It would be like the sentence that was popular about 15 years ago, I suppose, that goes like this. I really love fast food. Not. With me? You stick this not at the very end and it negates everything you just said in some kind of sarcastic way. German puts its verbs at the end of a sentence. Any German speakers here? And because it does that, sometimes when you hit a verb at the end of a sentence, it makes the sentence mean something different than you thought it was going to mean. Does that make sense? There's these little syntactic surprises that he puts into his writing. And so we're not gonna get any of that kind of syntactic, clever, sarcastic sense of surprise in the sentences that he wrote in the original.
But we have that in comedic writing, it's called the reversal, where you bring you create an expectation for the person where it's gonna be like a super large amount of something, like, for example, the building towered over me. It was only to my knee in height. Where basically you flip the sentence on there. It's kind of the same idea, only used with verbs rather than